Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Professor.
We're not all here, but let's start because we don't have much time as always. So today, as I told you Tuesday, what I want to do is to finish up chapter 8 and then to keep the part that has more to do with the one, namely chapter 9, 10, and 11 for next week. Today we're going to finish chapter 8 and particularly we're going to concentrate on the relation between the nous or intellect and the one. It's a very difficult topic, so I'll try to be as clear, concise, and precise as possible. That's the first thing that we're going to do. And then I want to leave the 4, so I'm going to leave hopefully a good half hour for your questions, which I hope you are prepared, and I think you should have by now. All right, so the relation between the nous and the one. As we said on Tuesday, the nous or intellect is the highest reality, and in that sense is the true and only reality, is the highest of all beings, okay, is the highest of all entities. We've also seen that this highest of all entities shapes itself into being, into its subsistence, through the act of vision. An act of vision whereby the beholder coincides perfectly with the beheld. So the coincidence between the two, when it comes to the intellect, is not just a matter of deeper or less deep familiarity, as it is the case for all realities up to the soul, but is a coincidence, an identity which is essential, is substantial. And this identity is the identity of the maker with the made, of the beholder with the beheld. Now, this is already an important point to keep in mind because it tells us something regarding the notion of identity. How are we to think identity? Identity, as you might know, is a Latin word, comes from the Latin idem, and is perfectly coincident with the English word self, self-same. So when we say identical or self-same, are we referring simply to a tautology? That is to say, are we saying something as empty as the tree is the tree? When we say that the tree is identical to itself, are we simply saying that the tree is the tree? If we were to say that, it would be a tautology, and hence it would be a useless, meaningless, and in fact, empty kind of statement. However, when philosophers, starting from Parmenides and down to Plotinus for what we're concerned, passing through Plato, talk about the identity of an entity with itself, they are not stating an empty sentence in the form of a tautology. They are instead making a statement regarding how anything as anything is and can be what it is. Plotinus here is talking about the self-sameness of the intellect, the identity of the intellect, the fact that the intellect is one and stable in its being intellect. And in saying so, Plotinus is trying to understand how this takes place. And as we said, how does this take place? Through a making. A making which unfolds as the grasping through vision of an object of vision, which in the case of the intellect as object coincides perfectly with the beholder. So what is at stake here is an attempt at defining what identity as self-contained, self-held singularity actually means and entails. Is this clear? I know it's a very difficult thing to grasp, but let's try to clarify it through some kind of example, even though coming up with examples when we are in such a sphere is quite difficult on the one hand, and it can be misleading on the other. When I think, when I grasp with my thought, and hence with my gaze, something, I grasp this something as a unity. The question is, where does this unity come from? Later philosophy, from Descartes on, and culminating with German idealism, sees the source of this unity in the grasping act of the beholder. The beholder is the one that, by imposing on the outside certain schemes, imposes on the outside also the boundaries of unity. These schemes are called the boundaries of logic. For the ancient tradition, for ancient thought, the unity is not imposed by the beholder, but is already in itself in the object that is beheld. And if anything, it is the beholder that is brought into agreement with that unity by that unity itself. So, for the ancients, when I look at a plant, at my dog, at my foot, at my table, at whatever, I grasp them as many unities, as many singular things, as many identical with themselves things, because my gaze is attracted into the sphere of this in itself unity, and brought into agreement with it. Plotinus, oftentimes, also in this treatise, uses the image of vision. Vision for Plotinus is, can be talked of as divided in two moments. The first moment is the moment that he calls opsis, that is to say, the mere faculty of seeing, as such not yet determined. The second moment is the moment that he calls of orasis. Orasis is when this faculty gets determined by the object it fixes itself upon. So for the ancients, and that's the first point, the source of unity of a thing rests with the thing itself. And the vision that grasps it is brought in agreement to it and by it. That's the first point. The second point has to do with this unity itself. How does this unity subsist? It subsists as unity by an act of self-making or self-producing, whereby it stands as something. And this act of self-making is described by Plotinus as an act of thought, as thinking. Whereby thinking, as we saw already passingly in our previous lectures, this act of thinking is not to be understood as the unfolding of some kind of discursive thought, but is to be understood as a tension based on desire. Desire of one, desire of unity, desire to be one. Hence, everything, insofar as it is what it is, because it acts as this tending desire, a tending desire that strives towards unity. Here we have already a glimpse at what, or rather at how, to think about the one which, as Plotinus says, is none of the things. Whereas even the nous, the intellect, is one of the things, the highest things, the thing that contains them all, and the thing that works as the base for any other thing. The one is none of the things. How to think about it then? Well, the one is this, can be thought of as this underlying tension, which keeps desire directed towards it. So, the nous is this highest reality insofar as it is that reality that manages to keep itself in unity in a perfect way, in an accomplished way, in a way whereby it doesn't need to seek a further unification. It's already as united as possible. Now, what is the relation between the one and the nous? This is a point of contention among philologists, above all, whose discussions are mostly misleading in this domain. And that's because they don't think philosophically most of the times. Philologists tend to tacitly distinguish in a sharp way the one and the nous, the one and the intellect. And the result of this tacit, sharp distinction is willy-nilly that the one itself be thought as another thing. But we just said that the one is no thing, as Plotinus himself says many times. Hence, any substantial distinction, any sharp distinction between the one and the nous, or for the matter, between the one and anything that is, so even my dog, even my foot, even a tree, is philosophically nonsensical. What is then the relation between the one and the nous? Is not the relation between two distinct things. Is instead the self-relating of something that by tending to unity is self-making, and it makes itself while being bent on itself. To clarify this point, I want to read to you a line, a sentence in chapter 8. So if you go to chapter 8, in the middle of chapter 8, let me see the page here. If I put page numbers, I haven't put page numbers. Okay, the middle of chapter 8, the second page of chapter 8. Okay, so go to chapter 8. Don't stop at the first page of chapter 8. Go to the second page of chapter 8. And once you are at the second page of chapter 8, go to line 6. Plotinus asks, given that these two are one, namely the beholder and the beheld, the nous is two, but is one, right? The nous is two insofar as it is beholder and beheld, but is one insofar as beholder and beheld, as we said, coincide. Given that these two are one, how come that this one is many? And it is many because, as we said, the nous contains everything. Certainly, because it, the nous, does not act as vision as one. Since even when it acts as vision on the one, it does not do so as one itself. Otherwise, it would not come into being as intellect. But having begun as one, it did not stay stably as one, but it escaped itself as it was getting many, as if it were drunk. And it unfolded itself because it wanted to possess everything. It would have been better for it not to want that, since because of that, it has become second. Okay, let's stop here. two things are important here. The first, the nous, the intellect, is bent towards the one. The nous looks at the one. First. But when he looks at the one, how does he do so? Not as one anymore. Why? Precisely because it has become consciousness of the one. Now, in other words, the one possesses itself as one through an act of vision / consciousness. So it has become two. So when it looks at the one, it doesn't look at the one as one, but already as two. And when it looks at the one, what is it that it sees? That's another question that Plotinus asks in another treatise, which is treatise 5.1. What is it that it sees when it looks at the one? It sees itself. It sees itself and it seizes itself. And by seizing itself, it is trying to stick to the one, that is to say, stick to oneness as much as it is possible. So let's go back to the question that we started from. What is the relation between the one and the nous? It's not the relation between two distinct things, but it is instead the unfolding act whereby the nous, the highest of all entities, keeps itself up by perfectly striving towards, tending towards, circulating around, if you will, the one. And mind you, what we are saying of the intellect can be said of any entity. The difference at that point being in the level of intensity of this desirous tending. In other words, my tension towards the one doesn't manage to come to perfect completion or to keep itself in that perfect completion whereby it would perfectly circulate like a circle around this center that is the one. Okay? That's where the difference between different entities gets important. Now, is this clear? Because now I need to take a further step, but I need this to be clear.
So if the one is the nothing or the thing in which the nous tends towards, then does that mean that there is no end towards this tending? And if that is the case, then how is it possible that the nous can come to become one with the one itself?
The ending of the tending is there because it's the tending towards identity, where identity means the keeping, the self-keeping of each thing into itself. That's why I said the identity is not thought philosophically an empty tautology, but is that moment whereby a thing is a thing insofar as that thing keeps itself together. Okay? Let's to think of it through an example taken from physics. I think it is the second law of thermodynamics. I'm not sure which one of whether the first, the second, or the third. In any case, one of the laws of thermodynamics talks about something called entropy. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
You're familiar with the law of entropy, right? Now, the law of entropy says that everything tends to confusion, right?
Yes. Correct.
Everything tends to dissolve, to mingle with anything else. Hence, everything tends to chaos. Right? Yet, we do see that each thing, at least for a period, keeps to itself. In other words, we do see that things hold themselves up together. Each holds itself up together.
Yes.
Okay. Where is the ending for each thing of this keeping itself together? Is in the thing itself, insofar as this thing manages to keep itself together. So the ending of this desirous tending that, for example, makes up my dog is in my dog staying as my dog and not becoming one with the table or one with the carpet or one with the plant that it smells in the morning. Correct?
So in the case of living beings, it's just insofar as they can keep themselves alive.
Yes. Yes. Now, the entity that manages to stably and constantly bring and keep itself into this perfect unity is the intellect. That's why Plotinus, regarding the intellect, uses the image of the circle that circulates perfectly around the center. Okay? So the ending is not to be understood as the striving towards a goal that is put somewhere else and is fixed and things tend to it and eventually reach it. The ending is something, let's use this word, endogenous to the thing. The telos is not
So
outside,
it's like a telos, the
inside.
fulfilled state.
What again?
So it's like the telos, which is the state of fulfillment, which things always keep themselves in that state of fulfillment.
Yes, exactly. Is inside. It's not to be thought of as an outside. Okay? That's why I said that if we think of it, and we think of it philosophically, that is to say, if we really think of it, the one is not distinct from me, for example. Insofar as I am already circulating around the one. So the one is inside of me, to use this inadequate language of inside, outside, okay? And this is something that Plotinus himself says. For example, in chapter 10, I think it is, he says, how are we then to grasp the one? And he says, well, with what in us is similar to it. And then there are other passages in which Plotinus says explicitly that the one is present in every and anything. The discourse of presence in Plotinus is a very complicated one, so I won't get there. The way he articulates this discourse about presence, which is very interesting. But just one thing, things are present for Plotinus insofar as they make themselves present, that is to say, standing, by tending towards the one. While at the same time, one is this force of attraction, whereby what would be otherwise scattered circulates around a center. Okay? In that sense, the one cannot be thought as one of the things. It is none of the things. It is no thing. It is no particular thing. While on the other hand, particular things are only insofar as they tend to this, let's call it center of gravity, if you will. This point of gravity, this absolute point of gravity. Echo, like you could think of the one, let's use another astrophysical metaphor, okay? Black holes. What does a black hole do? A black hole attracts into it, right? Whatever rotates around it. To the point that when something gets too close to it, it collapses on it. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Think of the one as a sort of black hole, which, though, doesn't swallow things down, doesn't make them disappear. Instead, as a gravitational force, allows them to subsist as what they are. Now, the subsistence is, on the one end, a gift of the one, on the other, the result of the capacity of that very thing, which circulates around the one, to circulate around the one perfectly, stably, that is. Hence, as stable, perfect presence. Okay?
Sorry, Prof. I have a question. So everything is circulate around the one, right? The one is a center, like a black hole. So they circulate at the same way, or they have a different, different way. I mean, it's like they tend into the one as the same level or have different level. For example, man will tend in the one more than the animals, this kind of thing.
The difference is not between men and other animals so much. The difference is between the layers of reality. So material realities, or realities that are in the sphere of sense perception, to speak more precisely, they have a tension towards the one that is not perfect, is in flux, okay? And that's why they go towards the solution. The intelligible realities, so numbers, geometrical schemes, the ideas of things, those gravitate perfectly around the one. And they never dissolve. And these realities are found in the soul. And the soul gravitates around the one almost perfectly. I say almost because the soul already unfolds as a series of ideas, a series of levels. Above the soul, there is the intellect. The intellect gravitates around the one, circulates around it as a perfect circle, in which every moment of it happens at the same time with all other moments. Okay, so the intellect in that sense is the perfect, absolute, present entity, or the perfectly, absolutely present entity. Okay? I hope this
Okay.
Now, if this is clear, let me see what time it is because I want to leave room for questions. Yeah, we have until when do we have?
10:40.
We have until 11:15, right? More or less. Yeah, I guess so. Okay, let me say just this tiny thing, and then let me do one thing though. Sorry, I have to start the air conditioning because it's very hot in here. Okay, sorry. I was sweating a bit too much. Okay, if this is clear, and by the way, let me again say something about this thing of clear, not clear, and blah, blah, blah. Many of the things that we are saying will appear to you as quite puzzling, okay? And that's completely normal. The problem would be if they were not to puzzle you. But if they puzzle you, if you perceive them as mind-boggling, you are on the right path, okay? Now, all the questions that you're writing down, pose them after, once we go to the question section, okay? Now, let me say just this thing, which is then going to introduce us next week to our thinking about the one itself. The question that leads our course is the question of being. The question of being tries to see how thinkers have thought of being itself. So how thinkers have approached, if they have at all, the question regarding being itself. The question about being itself, as we said, is not the question regarding one of the entities or the entities in their totality, but is the question regarding what it means to say is. Plotinus is the thinker who, according to certain philologists and certain philosophers as well, is the thinker that before Martin Heidegger has tried to explicitly think beyond entities. And in that sense, Plotinus would be a thinker who has explicitly posed the question of being. What is the problem though? The problem regarding this statement in relation to Plotinus emerges when we reflect on the way in which Plotinus thinks of the highest entity, the nous. And particularly of how he thinks of the relation of the nous with the one. And what is the problem? The problem rests on the fact that Plotinus does not think being per se, but thinks being starting from an entity, be it even the highest of all entities, namely the nous. And in his thinking of being in relation to and starting from this highest entity, he inadvertently thinks of being as the unfolding of a making. Hence, he thinks of being within the frame of cause and effect, whereby the being of the nous is ultimately the effect of a cause that causes itself. The question then is a twofold question. Is this way of thinking regarding being relatable, or can it be put in parallel with the way that Martin Heidegger has attempted? And can it even be seen as something, as a precursor of Martin Heidegger's way? That's the first question. And this question, this first question, is a historical philosophical question. Which, by the way, is not focused on the attempt of trying to come up with some kind of erudite history of philosophy, but is rather trying to attempt to understand where, in relation to the unfolding of the kind of thought that since the Greeks has brought us here, where Plotinus stands, and whether his thought represents a possible way out of the path that from Plato has led us here to the world of technique in which we live. So that's the first question. The second question has to do with the way of thinking regarding being as framed within the relation cause and effect. And the second question would sound like this. We see that in Plotinus's thought, the identity of each entity, even of the highest entity, is ultimately thought of within the frame of cause and effect. is it possible to think being and our relation to it not as determined by the frame cause and effect? And why is this question important? It is important because the understanding of being and hence of things as determined by the frame cause and effect is the underlying structure, conceptual structure, on which all our world as we see it, with all the problems that it has regarding the overwhelming power of technology, of technical means, of systems of various nature, political, economical, technological, all intertwined among themselves. This entire world rests on an understanding of the being of things and of our relation to being, which is determined by the frame of cause and effect. So, asking that question, namely, let me repeat it, is it possible to think of being otherwise than within the frame of cause and effect? That question has a particular urgency insofar as the answer to this question would determine the way in which we go about understanding the world in which we live and imagining different possible ways to be in the world. Is that clear?
Yes.
All right, so now I shut my mouth and I leave the floor to you.
I have one question regarding the nous itself. So early on you also talked about the logos as a type of gathering together, and you also mentioned in an old class that the logos is the telos or state of fulfillment for man. And the nous is the intellect, which is also that which is able to grasp what is being gathered. So which is the more primary of the two? The logos or the nous?
The logos in its perfect form. And the human being, insofar as it attains the logos, it attains the nous. That's why Plotinus says that the wise man, lelogis theithi, the wise man has become all logos. The wise man lives perfectly at the level of logos. So there is no distinction between nous and logos. Nous is the gathering together of each single logos, and each single logos is the gathering together by itself and of itself of each single entity. And in that sense, the nous is the hyper logos, so to say, is the gathering that gathers every gathering, if you will.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Okay.
Hi, Prof. Got a question on the one.
Yeah.
So we see that the one is a really slippery concept, right? It's very difficult to put anything to it. And as far as I can tell, it has something to do with a state of being in all things.
Yeah.
And we also see that the nous is the highest form, is where the tending ends, right? So to what extent is it like defeating the purpose of the one to even talk about it? Because it's not a thing, right? It doesn't have attributes. So can you even talk about it and like draw distinctions between it and everything else?
Okay, your question is very, very interesting because on the one hand, it goes right to the core of a problem that Plotinus himself highlights many times. On the other hand, it opens up an avenue of reflection for us on what I was saying before, namely what happens when you try to reach the dimension of being by basing yourself on an entity, which is what Plotinus does ultimately. So let's look at the first part, which is a bit easier to talk about, to discuss. Plotinus says many times in the Enneads, and also in this treatise in chapter 10 above all, that first of all, anything we could say about the one is deficient. Anything. Because yeah, the moment you talk about it, you're already objectifying it. So in a way, speech and talk are inadequate ways to approach the one. In fact, when he says anything about the one, he makes whatever he says be preceded by a word, by an adverb, in Greek, ion, which means sort of. It means sort of. It means so to say, right? So every time that Plotinus talks about the one, he talks about it very, very cautiously. And he makes it clear to the reader or the listener that caution is needed. On the other hand, he does say that we can grasp it. But how? We can grasp it through an activity which is beyond language and which is beyond discourse, beyond intellection understood as discourse. In fact, in chapter 10 and chapter 11, or chapter 9 and chapter 10 now, I don't remember, he uses twice two words which are cognate as for the root. Epivoli and prosvoli. Now, I don't remember in my translation how I rendered them both, but what they mean is some kind of jumping up, some kind of launching yourself into, okay? So the one can be grasped not by thinking about it, not by talking about it, but by almost feeling it. And what is it that you grasp when you throw yourself into it all at once, right? Athroa, it says, epivolia athroa. Athroa means all at once. Well, you feel, you are into a perfect act of self-willing. So the one, ultimately, if we want to sort of think about it, can be thought of, as Plotinus does in another treatise, which is very interesting, it's treatise 6.8. It can be thought of as the highest possible act of will. Is that will that wills itself as will. is pure will. Will of itself as will, hence will of being. Of course, this is something that no discourse can grasp. This is something that, as you were saying, is a state of being. So it's something that must be felt. By the way, two things which have to do with the position of this thought by Plotinus within the unfolding of Western thought. One, the treatise 6.8, in which the one is talked of as the will of will, is a sort of anticipation of all the subsequent unfolding of Western thought. There one can find already expressed what Nietzsche will say. And by the way, if one reads the treatise against Nietzsche, I mean, in relation to Nietzsche, one sees how Martin Heidegger was 100% correct when he said that Nietzsche is the most, is the wildest and most unleashed, so to say, of all Platonists. Platonism ends up in an understanding of being as will, which is what Nietzsche does. A. B. Still within the bedrock of the tradition, that thought that we find expressed in 6.8, in which resurfaces in Nietzsche, even though Nietzsche had no direct knowledge of Plotinus, that thought is the guiding thought of all of Bergson's philosophical project. When Bergson talks about durée, which in English is translated as duration, as opposed to the unfolding of chronological time, he talks of the durée as the act of self-willing and self-sustaining of what circulates around itself. And as for Bergson, the links with Plotinus are clear and explicit. Why am I saying this? Once again, to underline the fact that in Plotinus, we find traces of how the way of thinking about being, which starts from Plato, the way of thinking of being which starts from Plato ends up. And the further manifestation of this appears, if you will, in a more explicit form, in subsequent thinkers. But it's already there. That's why Plotinus is interesting, because it's a culmination of the Platonico-Aristotelian philosophy, and as such is an explicit anticipation of all the unfolding of the subsequent tradition. Now, this way of thinking about being is based de facto on an avoidance of the question of being as being. Because as I said before, it thinks of being always starting from an entity. It never thinks of being per se, which of course is an extremely difficult thing to do. We think of being starting from entities because they are, in a way, the first thing that we can relate to. And we can relate to them through being, but being itself remains hidden, remains in a way not unrelated, but unrelatable. It is related to us. It's the first thing that is related to us, because the dimension of meaningfulness is the one in which we swim. But precisely because we swim in it, we're not aware of it. And becoming aware of it becomes extremely difficult. You can think of it, if you want to make an analogy, think of it through the analogy with the effort that the yogi or the Buddhist tradition makes to make us concentrate on our breath, right? Of course we breathe, and we can do anything else that we do and that we're conscious of only because we breathe. If I stop breathing, I die, and at that point I can't move my hands, I can't see the sky, I can't pet my dog, I can't taste water or wine or whatever, right? And yet I'm not aware of the fact that I breathe. I don't think about it. But anything that I do because I breathe. So the effort of the one who meditates is that of concentrating on this most primeval of all acts. An act, by the way, that doesn't depend on me. It cannot be thought in terms of cause and effect. I breathe because I breathe. The relation with the one, the relation with being is the same as the relation to breathing. Meaning, I can see a plant as a plant. I can relate to it as a plant while I myself am a human being, because I am immersed in the dimension of being, which is the dimension of meaningfulness, which makes possible the dimension of meaningfulness, within which I relate to things as things. And yet, do I ever think of being per se? No. The way I don't think about breathing per se. I just breathe. Now, the moment I try to think about breathing, I can go about it scientifically and start from the lungs and then explain the thing as a mechanism of the lungs. Or I can start from the blood and think of it as the carrying of oxygen by the blood, and so on and so forth, right? And hence I fall within the cause and effect kind of thinking. What if instead, as the Buddhist or Hindu tradition tries to do, I just concentrate on the happening of breathing? What happens there is a different way of relating myself to myself and to things. That's why one practices meditation. Similarly, I can think of being as the tradition has done, even when it tried to break free, starting from a thing. And at that point, I'm back again into the cause and effect kind of thinking. What if instead I were able to immerse myself in the free dimension of being? Possibly a different way of relating to myself and to things could emerge. But of course, this is a very difficult path to take. It's a path that eliminates from under our feet all foundations. Thinking of being starting from entities is something that we do because we need foundations, because the human being tends to do everything on foundations. Whereas thinking of being as being is groundless. Okay? As I said, these are very difficult thoughts to wrap our minds around. And in many ways, they are the best way to get a headache. In fact, I mean, I'm getting a headache right now, by the way. So don't be surprised if you find this thing puzzling to the point of wanting to, wanting to curse the moment you decide to take this course, okay? It's normal. And I mean, confession time, I myself, sometimes I'm tired of this stuff because it's very difficult to handle. It doesn't let itself be grasped. It's a bit like the heelfish, that you think you grasp it and then it escapes you from another side. On the other hand, is maybe not only a very useful exercise for the mind, but as I told you before, is maybe the only realistic way to think of an alternative manner of living than the one in which we're steeped, and which, by the way, only a blind wouldn't see as problematic, as deeply problematic for the very survival of not only the other species, but the human being itself. So sorry for the long answer.
Yeah. I think I have a question.
Yeah.
If we see a culture, what the cultural pursuits that's done by different human cultures as an expression of trying to get closer to the one, to that inner humanness. But then we see that there's a diversity of cultures around the world, and not just diversity, but sometimes these cultures that emerge may even be contradictory to each other. Like one's beliefs can exclude the veracity of the other's beliefs. And so how come that there can be this sort of diversity if what they're trying to do is really this culture is trying to get closer and closer towards the one?
Well, the one has not to do with some kind of fixed truth that be expressed in codified words. And moreover, the discourse that Plotinus carries out is one grounded in a question that starts from an understanding of things that is not anthropological or cultural, but is mostly based on nature. That is to say, Plotinus would say that a yogi tends, as an entity, tends to oneness as much as a samurai tends to oneness. So it doesn't have, Plotinus's thought doesn't concern itself with a view on things that be centered on anthropological considerations. Okay. Then, of course, I mean, any any and every culture tends towards something, right? But that's another discourse, that's another problem, which, as I said, has nothing directly to do with this kind of reflection, which is, on the one hand, much more general, on the other, much deeper, right? One could say that every culture is different because then every culture tries different ways to go about the same thing in the end.
So, Professor, moving back to the breathing meditation, if we understand it in Plotinus terms, it's like a desirous tension towards the observation of the breathing. Then in that case, can the one here just be recognized as the breathing itself? Because that is what the tension is towards at that moment.
Yeah, in a certain way, yes. Of course, as I said, we have to be careful with these analogies. These analogies,
It's not the one itself, but what can be synonymous with in that situation.
I mean, as way of an image that facilitates our thinking around this very difficult thing to grasp, yes, we can, but again, we must use caution, as I said.
But even within the tradition of like breathing meditation, there is also mentioned the different states of concentration, of which one of which the higher ones are characterized as being completely free from discursive thought. Then in that case, how can we actually think about the problem while within the state of the meditation itself? Because if there is no discursive thought happening, you can only think of it after the meditation has ended.
Yes, yes. In fact, Plotinus says in 3 or 4 passages of the Aeneid, one of which is at the beginning of 5.1, another is in 5.3, I guess, I don't remember. He says exactly that the thinking starts precisely the moment that you come out of the state of perfect unity. But when you are in the state of perfect unity, there is no thinking. There is just being one with the one. Monos pros monon, he says, alone towards the alone. Now, Wei Min has a question as well. The imagery of a circle with all realities, with the one being at the exact center and where the nous emerges, is interesting. It's also stated that the lines emanating from the center represent the forward dispersion of all realities which do not have constant tension towards the one. As such, can we say that all realities emanate from the center, that is the one, without any constant tension towards the one, and the nous only emerges when the desire of itself, desire the one, rises, and these lines turn towards and around the one, gazes at the one. Yeah, okay, yeah. Emanation is one way in which people have tried to understand what Plotinus says. Is not incorrect, but is incomplete if we don't think of it in terms also of conversion towards the one. So emanation is the process whereby things descend from the one as lines from a center, but this process has to be thought together with the opposite process of reconversion towards the center, which is what then allows the emergence of circle, of the circle of circles rather, okay? So, yeah, the tension, being the tension towards the one, is the moment of conversion, of going back to the source, basically. Plotinus thinks of this in terms of prodos, which means procession, prodos, and epistrophy. Epistrophy, which means precisely that, conversion. That is to say, verging back towards conversion. Now, in Tsing, I think there's in Tsing How do the wise men that Plotinus speaks of become wise? Can discursive thought have any constructive role in that? Is philosophy considered a discursive attempt since it is mobilized by language that ends up reinforcing us in our position of a knowing full stranger from the one? Okay, so let's start from, let's synthesize this question in the question of what's the role of philosophy? Because, you know, starting from that, we can also answer how does one become wise according to Plotinus. The role of philosophy is that of propedeutically educate the soul to start looking at things orderly. And the things that you learn by doing that is to conduct yourself in a certain way and to approach things in their logical structure. Once you gain this, you can then go to the source of any logos. And the source of any logos is above logos itself. And what is this above logos itself? The one. So the logical, which is also moral, propedeutic, is the thing that philosophy grants you. And in that sense, philosophy is not, as far as Plotinus is concerned, is not something that can be discarded. So philosophy, as Insing says, philosophy as mobilized in and by language is not skippable as a moment. You must go through it. But you must go through it to something else. And what is this something else? As I said before, the originary source, the archi, the commanding origin, the commanding principle of all logically organized realities, of all logically, by logically you must think of logos, of all logically organized entities. And this thing, as Plotinus says itself, is not logos anymore, is above logos, is beyond logos. That thing is the one. And the one, as we were saying before with Joel, you cannot grasp through language. Any discourse around the one is to be taken with caution and is possibly misleading. You can reach the one through what I would call almost an existential act, okay? All right, so I will stop here, guys, because at 12:30 I have another class and I need to head towards campus now. Otherwise I won't reach in time. I will upload the class as soon as I can, so tonight probably. And I'll see you on Tuesday, okay?
All right, Professor. Thank you so much.
Bye, bye guys.
Bye.
Bye.